From Wondery, I'm TJ Raphael, and this is Liberty Lost. Follow Liberty Lost on the Wondery app, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can binge all episodes of Liberty Lost early and ad-free by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify. A lot of people don't know about the maternity home on Liberty University's campus, or about the building attached to the godparent home, Family Life Services, an adoption agency which is also run by the same people behind Liberty University. It would lead me to find other women who were trapped inside the godparent home as pregnant teenage girls. Together, their stories would reveal a brutal and punishing system and would upend everything I thought I knew about adoption in America.
I was both terrified and I also felt a deep sense of this is my punishment, like I deserve this.
Will you help me? Will you become a godparent? Pledge $400 and save a baby from death.
It was torture. I wanted to run.
Our goal is 10,000 Liberty godparent homes.
I was a CPS investigator. There's no way that this was going to stay hidden forever.
They just thought that we were sinful and scandalous with our heathen pregnancies.
The Liberty godparent home, it's contagious.
At the end of the aisle, a petite, blonde Southern woman in her mid-30s and her dark-haired husband are waiting for them. Or rather, they're waiting for Abby and Nathan's son. And that's because today's celebration is not a wedding.
I was being punished and being told I wasn't worthy of getting to be the one who had him, be his mother.
And this couple, waiting for them at the end of the aisle, they've been chosen to be the baby's parents, whether Abby and Nathan like it or not.
And so I'm disgusted in my body every step I take forward. I'm just horrified by what's occurring.
They reach the end of the aisle, and Nathan forces himself to gently place his son in the couple's arms.
I just watched them holding him and felt empty inside.
Everyone prays. Abby and Nathan and the couple pose for photos, the newborn baby between them.
There's cake.
Gifts and speeches.
This is so wrong. This is like so dark. It's so evil. Like this ceremony is like a fucking joke.
This ceremony, this fucking joke, it's a celebration of something that was part of American life for decades. Back in the 50s and 60s, young women who got pregnant out of wedlock were forced to leave their homes and then secretly place their babies for adoption. But the truth is, it's still happening all over America. And it's all part of a grand plan to reshape the country in God's image.
Because the true Christian home that produces successful children must be headed by a godly husband. One man for one woman for one lifetime, and no sex, period, outside of marriage.
And to make sure the nation has the right kind of mothers.
They all saw how much I loved him. They didn't have to take him from me. They knew I didn't want them to.
From Wondery, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is American Scandal. By the time the full extent of Georgia Tan's illegal adoption network came to light in 1950, the story had already spanned decades and left behind a trail of broken families, unanswered questions, and lives permanently altered. While some of the children Tan stole went on to have happy lives with their new families, others suffered greatly. Some were forced to serve as laborers, some were starved and beaten, some were sexually abused, even by Tan herself. And at least 19 babies died under Tan's supervision at her Poplar Avenue orphanage. And in the years after Tan's crimes were revealed, birth and adoption records remained largely sealed, so few of the parents and children she separated could reconnect. And Tan and many of her accomplices escaped without facing any significant consequences. Eventually, their crimes faded from memory. But this isn't a story that belongs solely to the past. Similar things are still happening to this day. In Lynchburg, Virginia, there is a maternity home with a thriving and coercive adoption arm. It's called the Liberty Godparent Home, and it was created by the televangelist preacher Jerry Falwell in 1982 as part of his mission to end abortion.
To help save one child from abortion cost us about $400. Does a little baby mean that much to you? Will you become a Liberty Godparent? Hundreds have joined, and every one of them, we've sent them this beautiful little bronze baby shoe that simply says, you're one of our godparents, a Liberty Godparent.
The Liberty Godparent Home takes in teenage girls and young women who are sent there to hide their pregnancies. But what they find when they arrive is an oppressive environment where they are forced to sign over their babies to affluent evangelical Christians. My guest today is TJ Raphael. She's a journalist and host of the podcast Liberty Lost, a show that tells the stories of girls and young women who survived the isolation and manipulation of the godparent home. Our conversation is next. TJ Raphael, welcome to American Scandal.
Thanks for having me.
So your new podcast is an investigation into the Liberty Godparent Home, a place for young, single, pregnant women, not so unlike the homes run by Georgia Tann decades earlier. How did you first come across the Godparent Home? And what was it that made you feel that this was a story worth covering?
So I've been a journalist covering reproductive health for years. And after Roe versus Wade was overturned in 2022, I was scared. And since I'm a journalist, the way that I deal with fear is I report on things. It helps me to understand them. And getting that insight, I think, is also helpful for other people out there who might feel afraid. And so I knew following the end of Roe versus Wade that we would be entering a different time period that actually might look a lot like the past. And I think a lot of people, understandably, their minds immediately went to this idea that without Roe versus Wade, would be going back to this time of dangerous back alley abortions. And that's definitely part of the concern that people will take matters into their own hands in a way that is unsafe. But that was only one part of the equation in the pre-Roe era. The pre-Roe era was also one of forced birth and coerced adoption. And so as a journalist, when I started to think about how can I cover this, that's where my mind went. I felt like it was something that was being overlooked. And so I put out a call to people to say, if you had gone through a maternity home, if you experienced coerced adoption, please reach out to me.
In your podcast, you go to great lengths to show how powerless birth parents like Abby are in the adoption process. It is a much different experience for the adoptive parents. Could you describe how the laws around adoption might impact these parents on either side and how they've changed over time?
So when it comes to a birth parent in the United States, there's been a real push towards open adoption. And open adoption allows the birth parents to see the child that they place as that child grows up. But in many places, these open adoption agreements are not legally binding. They can be closed for any reason at any time by the adoptive parents. And so what I've heard in my reporting is it creates a really strange power imbalance. It's sort of like a custody battle that never ends. And it leaves a lot of birth mothers feeling powerless in the situation where they're afraid to, say or do the wrong thing for fear out of upsetting the adoptive parents and having that adoption close. In addition to that, lawyers that work for adoption agencies have lobbied state houses around the country to shorten the revocation window. So in most states, there's a period of time written into the law where a birth mother or birth father can change their mind about the adoption and can take back their parental rights. And, in some places like Florida and Texas, those revocations have been shortened now to just 48 hours. In Utah, it's 24 hours for you to be able to legally change your mind. And according to activists that we have spoken with, this is by design. The adoption industry in the United States remains a for-profit industry, and those who work on behalf of agencies want to protect their business. And so that means they want that revocation window as short as possible. In the state of Virginia, it used to be 25. So the laws in the United States, for the most part, tend to favor adoptive parents, people that have power and money to be able to adopt a child. also have the power and money to hire attorneys to do work on their behalfs. So in general, from what I've heard and from what research shows, it's an uneven power dynamic even after the placement is complete.
Given that there seems to be a trend towards this closing of the revocation window, the kind of, I suppose, tenuous status of open adoptions, all this legacy of a more closed adoption society that we inherit from Georgia Tan, what do birth mothers, relinquishing mothers, say after they've decided or were forced to decide to give up their children?
One study I read found that more than 70% of mothers who place their infants for adoption say they wish they knew more about their legal rights and about their options. A lot of women feel like they didn't have a really good sense of what their choices were. And if somebody would have just said, whoa, let's pump the brakes here, what is preventing you from taking care of your baby? Research shows that 9 in 10 times, the reason a woman relinquishes an infant for adoption is due to financial stress. And that sometimes if they had just $1,000 or $2,000 more dollars in the bank, they would have made a different decision.
So this policy of forcing Liberty students to go to the godparent home if they become pregnant, it could lead to a very cynical view of the entire apparatus, that the godparent home is a for-profit institution that tries to coerce as many young women as possible to make the decision to put their children up for adoption for the benefit of the home and the greater Liberty infrastructure. How cynical should we be about this situation? What is your opinion?
My opinion of the godparent home is complicated. In theory, on paper, I think that offering pregnant young women shelter, a place to get medical care, a safe haven during a time that they are the most vulnerable is a great thing. I think we need more places where low-income pregnant women who are in crisis, whether that's because they have no support around them, whether that's because they're in a domestic violence situation, whatever it might be, that they can have a place where they can reach for help. But I think inherently there's a problem with having a maternity home that is physically attached to an adoption agency. One of the former staffers that I spoke to was very clear that the adoption agency was supported by the babies that were being brought into the home. And so I think that there is an inherent conflict of interest with what the maternity home is and what the adoption agency is, given that they work together. They're under the same umbrella organization, which is the Liberty Godparent Foundation. They're both sub-entities of that. But I think, for at least from my reporting and the way it seems to be operating, I don't think it's a safe place for women to go to get help, unfortunately.
Now, recently, Falwell's Liberty University has attracted negative attention. In 2024, the Department of Education fined them $14 million, the largest fine of its kind. Tell us about what this fine was over and what kind of impact it might have had on the godparent home.
Yeah, so the Department of Education found that Liberty University was violating this federal student safety law called the Clery Act. The Clery Act requires colleges and universities to support victims of on-campus crime, including sexual assault, among other things. The Department of Education found that Liberty University had a policy of forcing pregnant students to go to the godparent home or face expulsion. I was actually absolutely shocked when I heard this. I had so many questions. Who were these women and what happened to them and their children? And so I reached out to the Department of Education for answers. I asked them how many students were made to live there and what happened to them. But the Department of Education, shockingly, told me they didn't know how many students were forced to live there because they didn't need that information to support their findings. And so, unfortunately, to this day, I've not gotten any clarity on how many students were required to go there. A maternity home on the campus of Liberty University, one of America's most powerful evangelical institutions, I was pretty bowled over, and I knew I had a story there.
How aware were you of Georgia Tan's influence on adoption in America while you started researching your story?
Yeah, so the name Georgia Tan actually first came up to me from Abby Johnson. Abby actually was the one who mentioned Georgia Tan. But I know that a lot of the same language that Tan used was being employed by the folks at Liberty Godparent Home. Tan argued that babies, would only thrive
in two-parent households,
that adoption could benefit society, that placing kids for adoption would reduce the burden on American taxpayers. And the Godparent Home staff really reinforced a lot of those similar ideas. The girls in the Godparent Home were told if they really loved their babies, they'd place them for adoption, that they needed someone better than themselves to care for their children, and that it wasn't right that they were going to be a single mom, and it wasn't right if they ended up needing government assistance. So as I listened to your series on Georgia Tan, alarm bells were going off. I was like, wow, because they were not good enough to be their own child's mother.
So the shame was not just that they got pregnant, but that they might keep their babies, because the Godparent Home, as Georgia Tan did, I guess saw poor or young single mothers as unfit parents?
Yeah, absolutely. One woman that we spoke with in the show, she was told that she was not equipped enough to care for her child. She was not good enough because of the things that she had done, meaning premarital sex, and that in order to get back onto God's path, placing her baby for adoption would be the solution. And the couples that worked with the Godparent Home were actually evaluated based on how religious they were. And this was, part of Falwell's plan to make sure that the babies would go to, quote unquote, the right kinds of homes. And so they were asked questions like, describe your salvation experience. How do you intend to plan for your child's Christian development? And they had to go through an evaluation to make sure that they were the right kinds of parents. And from the pulpit, Falwell also said several times, and we play some of this audio in our show, that adoptive parents had to be Christians committed to raising the child up in the favor of the Lord.
We mentioned in our intro that the Godparent Home was started by Jerry Falwell in 1982. Tell us more about him and why he created the home.
He was a controversial evangelical preacher who became a powerhouse in American politics. Falwell and his school, Liberty University, have ties to nearly every Republican presidential candidate since Ronald Reagan. And Falwell started the Liberty Godparent Home with the explicit goal of providing an alternative to abortion. Falwell's idea was he could set up a maternity home where unwed pregnant girls and young women would go to receive religious counseling, get healthcare services, and this home of his on the campus of Liberty University would be physically connected to a faith-based adoption agency that would also be run by the same people behind Liberty University. And so by offering these services in Falwell's mind, he thought that he could show Congress and the U.S. Supreme Court that there was no need for a constitutional right to abortion. Falwell never lived to see that dream become a reality, but from the pulpit, he often called on judges to basically take up the mantle here, and he pointed to his Liberty Godparent Home as the solution that everyone was waiting for.
You mentioned that in your research, you found a lot of similarities in the rhetoric used between Georgia Tan and the Godparent Home in terms of how they may convince young pregnant women to enter the home and use their services. Were there any other similarities? Because Georgia Tan was known for stealing children from parents, falsifying birth records, charging fees for adoptive parents. What about Falwell and the Godparent Home?
So the adoption agency attached to the Liberty Godparent Home does charge fees, adoption fees, in order to be able to get a child. They begin at around $30,000 to $40,000. And the girls were also incentivized to place their children for adoption, being told that if they, quote unquote, completed the program of the Godparent Home, which often included adoption, they would be rewarded with a full ride to Liberty University, a scholarship that was worth $100,000. On the whole, it seems that if they didn't place their children, they would not get these scholarships. And in the United States, offering cash in exchange for a baby is illegal, but it seems like scholarships are a different story, even scholarships worth $100,000. But in terms of other coercive tactics, the godparent home puts girls in counseling sessions where they're often told they're not good enough to raise their children. The Liberty Godparent Home does have an explicit faith-based message. So a lot of the girls that we spoke to, now women, reported that they were being told that because they had premarital sex, the only way to get back onto God's path was to place their children for adoption with a devout Christian couple. The baby was thought of as pure and sinless, and married couples were thought of as pure and sinless. So it made sense that they be paired up, because if the baby were to stay with the sinful mother, that would equate in a Christian's mind to celebrating sinful behaviors.
You've mentioned the home's explicit faith-based message and Falwell's attempt to interject faith into politics. He became well known for his moral majority movement. What was that, and how did it impact his influence nationwide?
Yeah, so the moral majority was started by Jerry Falwell in 1979, and it was a movement to really mobilize evangelical Christians as one cohesive voting bloc. And the moral majority is actually credited with helping to bring Ronald Reagan to the White House. And throughout the 1980s and honestly into the present, even though it's no longer called the moral majority, evangelical Christians have largely remained this conservative voting bloc. And that was a big part of his mission and something he would repeat constantly in his television show, The Old Time Gospel Hour, which at one point reached about 50 million people.
50 million people is a massive audience. And then, of course, Falwell has even more influence on the political sphere. How did he promote the godparent home, and what impact did that have?
Falwell would produce hour-long specials on the Liberty Godparent Home. And during these specials, he was constantly trying to raise money.
So I got to butt in real quick here. First of all, we were literally forced to go to church, whether we liked it or not. If we were Christian or not, you could be Muslim, you could be Jewish, I'm Jewish. And it don't matter. You had to go to Christian church. They would pretty much tell us that, if Dr. Falwell could get there in the rain, snow, and everything in his big old Suburban, we could do it too. Didn't matter if we were pregnant. But that's not the point. The point is, in church, well, there's a couple things that he was known for in church. If you knew his sermons, he always says, that you know. And then he always would be telling jokes that would be cracking the whole freaking congregation up. Now look, it's said about Dr. Jerry Falwell Sr., you either loved him or you hated him, okay? I got to know him. I did not agree with his rhetoric or beliefs or bullshit, but we were friends. He was my buddy, and we made each other laugh because we're both freaking funny as hell, okay? He's a funny guy. He does have a good heart and means well, regardless, which I write in a photo. You just keep watching the video, okay? You'll see my pictures with him and everything. Anyway, pertaining to him raising money, there's a joke that he made about himself in church one time. Now, Dr. Falwell, we call him Dr. Falwell, okay? Jerry, whatever. He said this joke himself, and I never forgot it because it's so fucking funny. Now, you have to know who all three of these dudes are to know that it's funny. So I will try to tell this joke as good as he did. I might get a little wrong, but that's okay. So, Benny Hinn, Billy Graham, and Jerry Falwell all die on the same day. They all go up to the gates of heaven where St. Peter is standing. And St. Peter says, "Oh my God," no pun intended, "oh my God, how can all three of these godly men die on the same day? We don't have room for all three of you godly men in here in heaven. We gotta send you to hell for a little while." So St. Peter calls down to hell, and he's like, "Look, these three dudes, they died, they came to heaven, they're at the gates of heaven. We don't have space right now. Can you hold them for a while?" Hell's like, "Hell yeah." Okay, Dr. Falwell did not say that part. Okay, so Benny Hinn, Billy Graham, and Jerry Falwell, they all three then go down to hell. They go to hell. And before you know it, hell is calling them back up to heaven, to St. Peter, and they're like, "Look, we got to get these guys the hell out of here. No, Dr. Frollo didn't. Not the hell part, anyway. We got to get these guys out of here. So St. Peter's like, all right. Just, what's going on? So hell is like, well, Benny Hinn is healing everybody. Billy Graham is saving everybody. And Jerry Falwell's raising up enough money to buy air conditioning. I think it's funny. If you know anything about Jerry Falwell and raising money. When he said that joke, look, I think it's funny as shit. So if you don't laugh, it's okay. Like I said, you either love him or hate him. Just keep listening, okay?
He would be calling on his viewers to write a check for $400. He even says, you might not have the money. Maybe you'll have to go into savings, and would encourage them to do that in order to become godparents. And he would say, you'll be a godparent of a little baby you might never meet, but one day you'll see in heaven and they will thank you. Special advertisements would cut in for the show, directing viewers to open their wallets. And it really seemed to be kind of playing on some of the fears of his audience. He would say things like, God is upset at you for not standing up for the life of the unborn. But it was really confusing to me, like where the money was going, because the godparent home doesn't pay for any of the girls' medical services. They actually were signing up residents like Abby to Medicaid. So the taxpayers were footing the bill. A lot of these checks, he even says this in his advertisements, they're made out to him or his ministry. So it's unclear, how that money eventually makes its way to Liberty Godparent Home.
On its most basic surface level, the godparent home is probably well-intentioned. But you spoke to one investigator who calls what the godparent home is doing clearly unethical. And he's a Liberty University graduate himself and was initially supportive of the program. What changed his mind? Who is this person? And why does he now feel like the home itself is unethical?
Yeah, his name is Evan Cater. Evan was in the U.S. military. He was in the Air Force, and while he was at active duty, he was getting his degree online through Liberty University. And eventually he decides to get his master's degree through Liberty University as well. And he has to take some classes on campus, and he likes the vibe of Lynchburg a lot. He moves his entire family, his wife and 3 kids to town. He thinks it's a great Christian town as he's wrapping up his master's degree. And he lands a job at Child Protective Services in Lynchburg. And while he's on the job, Evan comes into contact with a pregnant teenager that he has to place in the foster care system. So he goes to his supervisor and says, "Oh, we've got this pregnant teen. Where should I send her?" And his supervisor looks at Evan and says, "We're not sending her to the godparent home." She says, "They sell babies." And Evan is really taken aback. He's like, is this just a person that has a negative opinion about the godparent home? Is this a legitimate thing? He's not really sure. But at the time, he doesn't push his supervisor for more intel, and he arranges for this girl to be placed in a foster home and moves on with his day. But a few months later, he gets a call to deal with another pregnant teen. And this girl was picked up by the police from the Liberty Godparent Home. And Evan talks to this girl and asks her what happened. And this pregnant teenager says that, her mom dropped her off at the godparent home, and they kept asking her, would she place her baby for adoption? She kept saying, no, I want to keep my baby. And once she finally said no, they kicked her out onto the street. And, this is a pregnant teenage girl. She has nowhere to live. She has no job. And, this interaction, Evan told me, it made him change his opinion about the godparent home. And he actually said that it influenced his faith in God as well, because it was so counterintuitive to the image the godparent home was presenting, which, as I mentioned, he really believed in at one time.
So it sounds like the shame of being pregnant is probably one of the primary pressure points that the godparent home is using to get these young women to give up their babies. Talk about that a little more if you can.
I actually talked with a former godparent home staffer who told me guilt and shame were definitely tools of the trade. The godparent home, for the most part, knew that these girls were from evangelical backgrounds where they had done things like purity pledges, where they were taught pretty constantly throughout their upbringing that premarital sex was the carnal sin, the worst thing that you could do. It was really a two-pronged strategy to play on these girls' shame about their pregnancies, about the sins that they had committed, and then offer them a way back by placing their children for adoption with devout Christian couples because they were not good enough to be their own child's mother. And, the godparent home, I was able to get my hands on a few copies of their official handbook. It says that they are supposed to offer decision-making classes to each resident, both a parenting decision-making classes and a adoption class. But according to former staffers that I spoke with and multiple former residents, those parenting classes, they never materialized.
It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for a beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you.
I have died every day waiting for you. Darling, don't be afraid. I have loved you for 1,000 years. I love you for 1,000 more.
definitely our blood.
Time stands still, beauty all she is. I will be brave, I will not let anything take away what's standing for what